for having this forum. Thank you for giving us something to work on the last 12 months. We were looking for something to dig out from, as you say. I think the good news, though, is that there has been a lot of progress in this area, and actually a lot of what I have to share with you, I think I just heard Carl share with you. So I'll have a different perspective, obviously, with my PSDOCC hat on. And we've been asked to change that acronym since it's PSDOC, and some people don't like that, so we're going to do that. But anyway, I'll say PSDOCC in this meeting. It is a PSDOCC is a loosely formed organization. It's not real formal, but it does have a charter. It is a group that gets together, a group of SDOs, Standards Development Organizations. It gets together with PHMSA 2 to 3 times a year, and they talk about the regulations as they exist and the standards that are already referenced in the regulations, and how they might need to be changed, or what changes PHMSA is thinking of that might impact the use of the standards as a reference. In the regulation, it talks about upcoming rulemaking and how that might relate to standards and some of the technology groups and the industry groups and what they're working on with standards. I think it's been pretty good. It has been an exchange thus far since the group was formed in 2000 that has focused on an exchange of information between PHMSA and the SDOs at a pretty basic level, and I think that this activity that Carl just described to you with the new rule, which we sometimes not so affectionately call Section 24. Section 24 is, I think, going to change the nature of the PSDOCC group so that it's more public-oriented and not just oriented toward communication between the SDOs and PHMSA, and I think that's a really good thing. So with that, this is, again, an overview of the objectives of the group right now that exist in its charter. I want to point out that a lot of times before legislation on the Hill, before the ink even hits the paper, there's discussion in the hallways or there's whispers on the Hill that something is coming down the pike or being discussed, or a committee is looking into something. In this case, with Section 24, requiring that the standards be posted on the internet for free if they're part of a PHMSA regulation, the PHMSA personnel who participate with PSDOCC, they had an inkling of this discussion. They shared it with the SDOs, and that's really good because I can say the enactment date for Section 24 is January, even though the law was passed last December. The enactment date is January, and I think all but a couple of SDOs, as of today, the standards are available for free on the internet in different formats. Some are you can download, some are read-only, but all but a handful of the SDOs have been able to manage to this Section 24 before the enactment date of January. Some haven't. We'll talk more about that now. This is an idea of who these organizations are. Might be a bit small for you, but the American Petroleum Institute, it's small for me too. The American Petroleum Institute, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASTM, NACE is the Corrosion Society, the National Fire Protection Association. There aren't too many more groups. This is most of the groups that are part of PSDOCC. There are 2 points to make with this standard. First of all, and Carl pointed out that some of the SDOs they have as their mission their industry advocacy. But I do want to point out that several of the SDOs are 501c3 nonprofits that have education as their mission, or education or even public safety as their mission. So it's a mix of SDOs and even research organization that is part of PSDOCC. And to that point as well, when we have voting pools for development of these technical standards, often the subject matter experts who are part of these voting pools, which can be 500 people, they don't just represent operators. In fact, most of them do not. It's a mix of stakeholders, including government and the operators, vendors, equipment manufacturers, consulting folks, and even research. So there's an overlap. If someone is helping to develop one of the standards, let's say one of the NACE standards, the corrosion standards that Carl had up here, there's a good chance that someone who's working on the committee or in the voting pool on that standard is wearing a NACE hat, but maybe the company also has an API hat. Maybe the person has a mechanical engineering degree, so they're a member of that group. So regardless of what type of SDO we're talking about, there's an overlap where the expertise comes into play in most of the standards organizations. Next, just to go into the issues with the SDOs and Section 24, the first one I'll talk about being intellectual property, and then actually not so much issues, but I think paths going forward, more attention to public education and participation by public advocacy groups. So first of all, intellectual property, and this is really a catch-all phrase. We use it quite a bit, but it's not just a discussion of intellectual property in and of itself, but it relates obviously to accessibility to the standards in terms of price, as Carl pointed out. And Carl also said correctly that this is not something new. The discussion of how agencies, not just PHMSA, but how agencies work with the standards groups to reference industry standards rather than promulgating that many more regulations. That's been around, that discussion has been around for a long time, going back to the 80s with OMB Circular 119, which eventually was codified in 1995 into the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act. That was essentially, in writing, the OMB Circular 119 tips its hat to the intellectual property side of this discussion and says it does belong to the SDOs. And I think that a lot has happened since then, such that most agencies, and NACE, my SDO, we work with a lot of agencies in addition to PHMSA, and most agencies have moved over since OMB Circular 119 to referencing the industry standards, and everybody just thought it was a system that worked and it was going along. But now we have Section 24 as of last December, and it specifically says something that really caught everybody by surprise, that the notion, not necessarily the act, because like I said previously, some PHMSA personnel had told us this was coming, but the idea that the standards had to be free, because some of these SDOs, and I'm going to go back up here a second to this slide right here, and I'll use ASME as the example here. Thousands of pages of code have been essentially a boiler pressure vessel code. Is so large. It's not just it doesn't take just a committee or 10 committees or 20 committees to update that and keep it going and keep it the quality document that it is. It takes a business, and ASME has been around I think for over 100 years, and it is their business to develop these standards, and it was long before there was any idea that agencies would reference those standards instead of rewriting everything that's in them. So it's just something that we have to live with now, Section 24. It doesn't matter, how long we've been in business, or, if we've been selling standards for 100 years so that we could pay to make new standards. We have to live with Section 24, and like I said, most of the SDOs, almost all of them, have found a way to manage to it. But we do empathize with the SDOs that are continuing to be challenged by it. Another thing with the intellectual property, and this is the one thing where I think I disagree with Carl, is that we do feel like the fox guarding the hen house or the web house, that comment appreciated, but nonetheless, we do have large voter pools of subject matter experts, and the best place to get those experts are the people that have most of the experience, are spending most of their time working in these technical areas, and that is not necessarily, when we say industry, we don't mean just operators, but it's the operators, it's the manufacturers, the people developing the equipment who have so much to bring in terms of new technology and making advancements with pipeline safety with many different stakeholders, not just operators. And they have come together within the SDOs over decades to develop these standards in a way that we have these voting pools of hundreds of people. And I appreciate the comment that Carl had up there, that somebody had commented that consensus standards aren't necessarily the best standards because everybody, what do you have to do to a standard to get everybody to agree to it, or something like that, Carl, right? But having said that, most of the SDOs who follow the ANSI, the American National Standards Institute rules, unanimity is not required. It used to be in a lot of the SDOs, but it's no longer required in order to publish a standard. And so that was done to protect standards from being watered down, because if you require unanimity, that is one of the consequences. So I don't think that challenge is the same as it used to be, because most of the SDOs no longer require unanimity in these large voting pools in order to have a standard passed. I was asked to talk just for a second on cost. What does it cost to develop a typical standard? That means I do not have anything as large as a couple of the API standards or the ASME standards up on the screen, because they are so much larger than probably the typical standard. Then we go down one. This is probably more typical of a standard in that it's about a 40-page standard. This is a NACE standard. And you can see that to keep this standard going, it's constantly being discussed and often being debated and in ballot. It is supposed to be updated every 5 years, and I think that's what PHMSA wants to see too for all of its rules. But it's always in play somehow, and in committee, in discussion. This standard, even though it's probably one of the smaller ones, just the out-of-pocket cost over 5 years is over $250,000, and my organization, where this standard comes from, our business it's not built just for the purpose of developing standards. If there's an SDO where the business exists and the infrastructure of the business is there just for the purpose of putting out that standard, the cost, and then let's say you take a standard or a code that has 2,000 or 3,000 pages, it must, and again, my organization is not in this situation, but I can only estimate that it's millions and millions of dollars to maintain those standards in a effective way, in a quality way. So I wanted to point that out on the cost. And then, of course, most of the SDOs don't actually write the standards and their staff and then publish them. The SDOs are relying on volunteers from all these different stakeholder groups to actually provide the subject matter expertise in the voting pools for these standards. And so when you add up the cost of their time, usually, again, you have voting pools of several hundred people, and then you'll maybe have 10, 20 people, depending on the organization, that have to roll up their sleeves and spend hundreds of hours trying to put ink to paper that other people can vote on. And the cost over 5 years is really significant to the volunteers, the volunteer cost, basically. So that was intellectual property. The second item, educational outreach to the public. I think, now that most of the SDOs, all but a couple, 3, have been able to address what they have to do with Section 24, our focus is going to shift to a discussion about how we can be more supportive of public education as it relates to pipeline safety. I know in the case of my association, the mission is to protect the public and assets and environment from the effects of corrosion. It's really sexy, right? Corrosion. Anyway, that's our mission statement. But something that Section 24 has brought us around to is a discussion about, is it enough for us as a technical organization to be promulgating standards or hosting information exchanges and forums and conferences and training and certification that's very technical on pipeline safety, or should we be engaged in trying to not just protect the public via these technical resources, but also trying to do something that's less technical for the public to better understand it all? I think that's a discussion that PSDOCC is likely to take on, and that's going to be a benefit of Section 24 as we move away, I hope, from talking about intellectual property related to Section 24, move in toward the opportunities of strengthening what we do with the public. Greater participation. I mentioned ANSI before, the American National Standards Institute. Most of the SDOs, if not all of them, that have standards referenced by PHMSA are accredited by ANSI, the accreditation body in the U.S. Each country has one. In the U.S., that's the accreditation body for standards development organizations. They tell us basically that, for instance, that anybody has to be able to vote on the standards if you're ANSI accredited. Now, there are different, specific requirements on that, but essentially, if someone from the public wants to vote on a standard, whether they're a member of an SDO or not, or a paying member or what have you, if they put that request in writing, then they are allowed to participate in the standards development, and I'll show you a slide where they can do that in the next slide. Also, ANSI has requirements for balance of interest. So, for example, if we are closing out the ballot on a standard and there were 500 voters, 500 ballots that were cast, no more than 50% of them can be from any one interest category. The interest categories, again, vary by organization, but usually they're the operators, the vendors or manufacturers, suppliers, they might be sales. The categories vary, but no one category can have more than 50% of the vote before a standard is published, if someone is accredited to ANSI. Finally, I think that PSDOCC, and again, as a result of Section 24, and as we get past the issues of intellectual property, we're going to focus on how we can work with public advocacy groups to facilitate greater participation in the SDOs. At the last PSDOCC meeting, Jeff Weiss, who was there, but Jeff Weiss, had actually suggested that for those organizations that have not done so already, the SDOs, that maybe we could work with public advocacy groups who wish to attend our committee meetings but might not have the financing for travel, or just find a way for them to be able to participate. I think that there are some SDOs that have more resources than others and are already helping to financially underwrite public advocacy groups or consumer groups sometimes participation in the SDO activities. And I think that that's a discussion that we're going to have and hopefully will lead to more participation and a more formal role by the public advocacy groups in pipeline safety standards development. So this is, the PSDOCC released a white paper last year showing the standards development process and where the public has a role in that. And you can see there are several points here where the public can do everything from initiate the idea to actually, cast a vote. Because one of the other things is that if you're ANSI accredited, we don't limit who can vote by subject matter expertise level. So anybody can vote. For instance, on our corrosion standard, we're ANSI accredited, so we don't say you have to show us your credentials before you can vote. So there are several gates where the public can participate in the standards development process, and I can't promise you that every single SDO follows this exact chart, but in general, if you're ANSI accredited, this is the process that you're following, and the public does have access. Now, what we've learned, of course, is that access to the standards development process doesn't always mean that there's value, that we're getting the input that the public wants to give us, or that we're getting what would make the standards actually better in the long run. So this basically shows that the public has access, but we, I think, all recognize that a lot more could be done to make sure that value is is being realized in the pipeline safety standards as a result of greater public participation in their development. So going forward then, the intellectual property issues I think are almost resolved. Certainly they are resolved for most of the SDOs, and I think Vanessa is going to speak more to that in a little bit. We do believe that regardless of the outcome related to intellectual property issues, that the SDOs, that the model is there right now under the ANSI accredited SDOs to have the greatest number of subject matter experts working on these technical standards. And again, I should have said this before, I am addressing only technical standards, not some of the standards that are less technical, for instance, the standards on public outreach. PSDOCC SDOs pretty much focus on the technical standards. Regardless of the outcome of the intellectual property issues, we do believe that those subject matter expertise, large voting bodies and forums are the best place to continue standards development. It just needs, we need to take more steps to have other stakeholders, especially the public, at the table. And that also includes, I think we've heard a lot about public education outreach efforts, and certainly PSDOCC would like to be part of that, or actually initiate it with the SDOs, and I've already spoken with ANSI, again, the accreditation body that sets some of these requirements for developing standards, about what would they think about changing the ANSI requirements so that the public had to be at the table with certain safety standards. And certainly I think that they're open to that discussion, and hopefully after this week we could have a forum related to that, carving out a formal place for the public groups in the standards development activity. We are trying to fit, to some degree, when we talk about that, we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, because right now the technical standards are driven by technical discussion that is engineering, dominated by engineering and sometimes even science-oriented debate, and that's hard for some of the public groups to participate in. But I think we also realize that that debate on such a technical level would benefit if there was a break from that debate, or it actually started with higher level debate. For instance, the value of risk-based standards versus performance-based standard before we ever got into the technology, and that's a place certainly for the public. And so going forward, we will try to work with some of the public groups to maybe ANSI to carve out a formal role for the public groups, if they so desire, at the table for standards development. And I think that's it. Thank you.